Alright, I'm rested, I'm relaxed, and I'm ready for part 2 of this 2-part Halloween video. Let's just see how things are going with the first part. Oh. Well, that went over like a lead balloon. I guess not everybody loves Castlevania the way I do. That's a little disappointing, really. You know, I've been thinking about this for a while, and it's kind of obvious that no one was really into this whole Halloween video thing. And honestly, I'm losing steam here myself. There are so many other videos I could make, and here I am yammering on about random mooks from games that came out decades ago. It's pretty obvious what I have to do. And that's work even harder to convince people that this is worth talking about, because Castlevania Enemies kick ass, and the people need to know. So let's do this thing! Number one. To start things off good and weird, Granfalloon is a term made up by Kurt Vonnegut as part of the fictional religion of Bokononism, which plays a major role in his 1963 novel Cat's Cradle. One of the tenets of Bokononism is belief in something called a Keras, a group of at least two people whose destinies are cosmically linked together. A Granfalloon is a fake Keras, i.e. a group of people who think they're mystically connected, but actually aren't. Or as Vonnegut put it later in his life, a proud and meaningless association of human beings. Vonnegut cites as examples of Granfalloons the Communist Party, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the General Electric Company, and any nation, anytime, anywhere. He also includes Hoosiers, people from Indiana, on that list, which is kind of funny since Vonnegut himself was a Hoosier. Or wasn't, I guess, by his standards. This boss also just has a really cool design in general. In a lot of games it's just called Legion, but the Symphony of the Night translator was clearly very well read and decided to throw in a crazy, out-of-nowhere satirical reference into a game whose idea of good writing is this.
Tribute? You steal men's souls and make them your slaves. Perhaps the same could be said of all religions.
As Bokonon himself would say, busy, busy, busy. Number two. Look at that dapper gent. You can tell he's a man of wealth and taste. And he's pretty old-fashioned, too, which is appropriate since his name has a long history. Like all amazing things, Abaddon first appeared in the New Testament book of Revelation. There he was described as the king of an army of locusts, pretty much exactly how he appears in Dawn of Sorrow, except that the original Abaddon's locusts had human heads and scorpion tails. Ugh. Under the name Apollyon, he also appeared in John Bunyan's 17th century allegory The Pilgrim's Progress. There, he was a scaly winged demon who attacked the hero with an endless supply of flaming arrows. He's pretty intimidating in that book, living up to his name, which means destruction. In addition to having a cool backstory, this is also just a great boss fight in general. Abaddon himself is kind of comically harmless, because all he can do is hop around, but his swarms of locusts will seriously wreck you if you don't move quickly and strike hard. The background is awesome too. It drops the usual horror tropes and instead shows this bleak, windswept prairie that looks like even a demon couldn't live there. This boss is really just a class act all around. I mean, if I have to lose all my hit points to a cheap swarm of insects, and I have the choice between this guy and this guy, I know which one I'd pick. Number three. We all know zombies. Guy dies, he's infected with some kind of virus or magical voodoo powder, wakes up again and starts walking the night in search of brains, yawn. But let me ask you this. What if you take that basic zombie template and you add to it the ability to hop forward really stiffly at about 2 feet at a time? Chilling. Actually, these Chinese hopping zombies are a little more authentically creepy than I'm giving them credit for. They hop because rigor mortis keeps them from bending their limbs, which is also why their arms are held out like a bunch of blue B-movie Frankensteins. They also live in coffins and try to absorb people's life force to grow more powerful. Basically take a zombie, a vampire, and a Metroid, mush them all together, and you get this. Chinese horror writers love to stick these guys into all kinds of fiction. There's even a comedy kung fu horror film, and yes, those exist, called Encounters of the Spooky Kind, which spawned a whole subgenre of Jiangshi films. It's nuts. You might have heard of the Jiangshi before if you're a fan of Darkstalkers, or Overwatch, but they've actually appeared in lots of other video games too. They show up in haunted levels in Spelunky, as well as the Chinese-themed World 4 of Super Mario Land. And of course, the Jiangshi is a bonus boss in Order of Ecclesia, found at the very bottom of the Large Cavern, aka proof that Koji Igarashi hates us. After 8 rooms of the absolute toughest regular enemies in the game, enemies that are far more difficult and dangerous than most of the game's bosses, you run into this thing, and at first it's kind of funny just seeing it hop around. Then it starts spawning little versions of itself and homing magical attacks that will fill the screen from top to bottom if you're not careful. It's kind of a nightmare. Best of all, once you defeat it, a little prayer scroll will show up on its head to indicate that it's been incapacitated. Take my advice and do not take advantage of this moment to inflict a victory hit on it, because if you do, it'll spring back into action again, with full health. Shine on, Iga, you magnificent bastard. Number 4. While we're on the subject of bosses who make me laugh, no list of great literary bosses would be complete without this femme fatale from Portrait of Ruin. Astarte is the Greek version of the Mesopotamian deity Ishtar, goddess of love, war, beauty, politics, and terrible movies starring Dustin Hoffman. Seriously though, Ishtar is basically the goddess of everything under the sun. I can't even think of another Mesopotamian goddess, and I spent most of my junior year in high school just looking up the names of gods on Wikipedia. I was very popular. Anyway, since she's most famous for being the goddess of love, Astarte is the equivalent of the Greek goddess Aphrodite, but there's another Greek character that this boss seems to be much more closely modeled on: Cleopatra, Egypt's last pharaoh. And just as Cleopatra got in good with two of the most powerful Roman generals in history, Astarte in this game does everything she can to win your male main character over to her side. If any one of her magical Valentine hearts hits you, Jonathan will be instantly turned and start attacking Charlotte. The best part is that you can actually defeat Jonathan before finishing the boss, and if you do, there's a hidden cutscene where Charlotte basically goes, "What in the friggin' hell was that, you ass?" Or you can just spam Thousand Blades against her. That's pretty much what I did. Number 5. There's a lot of things that ordinary people find creepy. Spiders. Ghosts. Ghost spiders. But if you really want to make your audience uncomfortable, you can't go wrong with a fish. Just ask Hidetaka Miyazaki. Dagon is an ancient Canaanite god mentioned in the Bible as the Philistines' major deity. Yes, those Philistines. Dagon was supposed to have the form of a half-man, half-fish. Although he may not have at first, I don't know, it's complicated. The name originally came from a Canaanite word that, to this day, scholars aren't completely sure whether it means fish or grain. If it does mean grain, then we're dealing with a pretty run-of-the-mill agriculture god here, so let's stick with the fish interpretation. Dagon received a passing mention in Milton's Paradise Lost, but he really came to his own with the work of famous horror writer and off-putting human being H.P. Lovecraft, appearing most famously in The Shadow over Innsmouth, Lovecraft's only novella to be published during his lifetime. In this story, Dagon is one of the Deep Ones, a race of sea-dwelling elder gods ruled over by, who else, Cthulhu, and constantly scheming to take over the surface world. It's a pretty creepy story, and it inspired a lot of stuff in video games, ranging from Bloodborne's Fishing Hamlet to an obscure horror game for the Virtual Boy, as well as this boss. To be honest, Portrait of Ruin's take on Dagon is more doofy than creepy, especially with those flippers and the little baby frog head on its tail. It's a fitting send-off to a level that also has you facing off against bees, mushroom people, Audrey 2, and whatever this thing is. Number 6. Let's wrap up this list with one of the all-time Castlevania classics. Cerberus first appeared in Castlevania Bloodlines, before the Metroidvanias even began, and appeared on and off in some form up to the series' end with Order of Ecclesia. As you probably know, Cerberus was the three-headed dog that guarded the underworld in Greek mythology, generally seen as a pet of the underworld's ruler, Hades. Actually, the first mention of him in Greek literature says he has 50 heads, which seems like it might be a little awkward, but maybe we can just chalk this up to hyperbole. Also, a lot of portrayals show him as being part snake, but really, I mean, just about everything in Greek mythology is part snake, so I say we give it a rest with the snakes already. Cerberus' first appearance in Bloodlines is pretty intense. His front half is muscle-bound and looks super aggressive, but the hindquarters are emaciated and look like the flesh has been stripped off them. The contrast is effectively sickening, although he really can't compete with Behemoth from the same game, who goes totally hardcore in the whole not having a body department. In Symphony of the Night, Cerberus is the boss of the Abandoned Pit, a minor area that mostly serves as the entrance to the catacombs. Like most bosses in Symphony of the Night, he's cool-looking, but a real pushover. Cerberus also appears in Circle of the Moon as its first boss, and like most bosses in that game, he's incredibly frustrating and cheap. Funny how that works. As for Order of Ecclesia, that's a bit of an edge case. He shows up, technically, but not as a boss. Instead, he appears as a statue, blocking the way to Dracula's inner sanctum. To pass through, you have to collect 3 special glyphs throughout the castle, by exploring thoroughly and defeating a few hidden bosses. It's a stretch, I know, but there's something quite satisfying about destroying your foes by conjuring up giant ghostly wolf heads out of thin air. I mean, that's a fantasy we've all had, am I right? I know some of you are probably wondering why I just spent half an hour frothing over a bunch of enemies from a game series that no one even plays anymore. Here's why. Enemy variety is important. In fact, it's a lot more important than most people think. In any game that has a combat focus, the number and quality of enemy types is often the difference between a varied, interesting experience and a boring, tedious grind. Look at a game like Dark Souls. People praise it for its deep lore, intricate level design, and intense atmosphere, but what you're doing most often during the game is fighting regular enemies, and that would be horribly dull if you kept running it at the same ones over and over again. I know what that feels like, because I've played Dark Souls 2, where the enemy design was much less creative, and believe me, it's a serious slog. And it's not just Souls-like games that have this problem. A lot of developers lavish attention on their game's art, mechanics, and even level design, yet overlook the importance of enemy variety. Several games I've criticized on this very channel have had boring enemy design as one of their most fundamental problems. And on the other hand, many of my favorite games hold a special place in my heart precisely because they feature a wide variety of enemy types. Back in its heyday, Castlevania wasn't just a fantastic adventure game franchise, it was also practically the poster child for enemy variety. Every new game brought you face to face with dozens of strange and interesting new enemies, some of them reused, admittedly, but all of them offering something different from the next. This is why I talk so much about the enemies in Castlevania. It's because, when you get right down to it, these monsters, demons, and freaks are at the core of what made that franchise fun. Much like how Dark Souls would feel empty and dull without the lore contained in its item descriptions and NPC dialogue, Castlevania without its quirky enemies would be just a generic platformer with nothing special to recommend it. We may not ever see another Castlevania game, but that's no reason to give up hope that other games will come along and treat their enemies the way Castlevania did, the way they deserve to be treated. Remember what Michael Corleone said, you should keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Until next Halloween, stay spooky, everybody.